Okay. I'm excited to have the chance to talk to you about the design sprint. Sorry, you're seeing yourselves now. There we go. Okay. And I'd like to start talking about the design sprint by talking about really kind of what it's for. And the design sprint is a process for solving big problems and testing new ideas. That's really the core of the purpose of the design sprint process. Everything else is just sort of a variation or a tweak or an adjustment from that. And I think it's interesting to start by talking about ideas, because when we're working on new businesses or trying to create things or build things or design things, we think a lot about ideas. We think about what's the best way to do this thing. And the truth is that we all have tons of good ideas, right? We're all creative. We're more creative than we give ourselves credit for. And I think in the audience, every single one of you, you've probably got ideas for new businesses or new products you could create, or things you could build from scratch, or ways you can improve organizations or institutions or communities that you're a part of. And you probably know, or you believe that some of those ideas could be really, really great, right? Those ideas, they could really change things for the better. But you also know that not every idea is good. And some of those ideas, they might not be that exciting, or they might not make that much of a difference. And then, if you're thinking about it and you're sort of wondering which idea to pursue, you might also worry that some of those ideas are actually kind of dangerous. If you launch something new for your business, it could cause problems for your customers. It could be an unnecessary risk that would cause you to go out of business or lose money, something like that. So the challenge for people like us is not coming up with ideas, because we have plenty of them, but it's trying to figure out which of those ideas are really worth the investment of our time, our money, our resources, our energy, which of those things we really want to devote ourselves to pursuing and making happen. So imagine that you had a particular idea, one idea that you just thought was really exciting, you thought it really could work well. What would you do? Well, the old way of approaching this might be to go in your office, your house, your school, whatever, close the doors and get to work. Do market research and analysis and have debate with your team and make sure you get all the details right and make sure everything's perfect, and even, kind of obsess over it. And before you finish your idea and launch it to the world, make sure you've got it all exactly right. But this can lead to sort of a last minute panic or general freaking out as you realize that you've been working on your idea behind closed doors this whole time, and you deep down, truthfully, you don't know if it's going to be successful or not. It's scary. It's a big risk. So in response to this, people have started to approach their ideas in a different way. And you may have heard of this. It's oftentimes referred to as the lean startup model. And it's this idea that if you have an idea, you should very quickly find a way to build a minimal version of it, launch it to your customers, gather some data on how they're using it, and then use that data to help inform your decisions about what to do next with your idea, whether you're on the right track or not. And this is better. This is definitely a better approach than the old way of trying to figure it out all out on your own with the doors closed. But this has some problems too. The main one is that it always takes way longer than we think it's going to build that minimal product. We start out and we say, I'm going to build an MVP, a minimum viable product, and it's going to take a couple of weeks. It's going to be great. I'm going to bang it out, get it launched, get some data, and then months go by, and then it's 6 months, and then it's a year, and you say, oh, we got one more thing. We just got to tweak it. We got to get it just right before we launch it, and kind of defeats the whole purpose of this loop, of this lean startup process. And then when you do get to launch, you run into all the same risks that you would have faced if you had just waited to launch, right? Because you're still releasing something to the world. You're still putting something real out there in front of real customers. And then the data that you worked so hard to gather can sometimes be difficult to interpret. I've done most of my work with software companies. And if you imagine kind of a simple example from the world of software, imagine that we put up a new web page where we wanted people to come in and click the button to tell us if they were interested in our new feature, our new product. The data that we collect in this way, it could tell you how many people clicked the button, but it couldn't tell you why. And it couldn't tell you about the people who didn't click the button. And it certainly couldn't tell you anything about all the people who didn't even know your website exists, and they never got there for you to gather data from them. So this can sort of leave us wondering, did it work? Mission accomplished? Was this idea actually a good one? Are we going in the right direction? And what should we do? And so as much as we like to think that we would then go back around this loop and do it again and build again and gather more data, more often than not, we get distracted by the next shiny object and we move on. Fortunately, there is a better way to pursue our ideas. There's a way to shrink down this loop to focus only on the essential activities that we need to do to learn whether we're on the right track with our ideas. And that's what the design sprint is all about. The design sprint story starts in 2010 when Jake Knapp, who's my good friend and my colleague and co-author on the book, he started experimenting with new ways for teams to work together when they were starting big new projects at Google. And he took inspiration from Google's culture of hackathons and some ideas from the design thinking movement that he had heard about and kind of knitted them together, stitched them together. And he began to run these processes that he called design sprints with teams at Google. And he ran them with the team that created Google Chrome and Google Meet actually started out as a design sprint. And he worked with the Gmail team and Google Search. And around that time, this was now about a year and a half later, in 2011, I started working at Google Ventures, which is the venture capital firm that's funded by Google. And so what I would do is after we made an investment into a startup, I would go inside that startup and work with them, almost like a consultant, to help them figure out what they should build, what they should do, what direction they should head in. And we needed a better system, a better process for helping these companies figure out those big questions that they had. And we heard about Jake's design sprints. So we brought Jake to our team at Google Ventures, and we began running design sprints exclusively with the companies in the Google Ventures portfolio. And we ran them with all kinds of different companies: software, hardware, food, coffee, medical, healthcare, all kinds of different companies. And with each one of these sprints, we started out with a team, the people who had the right skills and the right experience to figure out whatever it was we were trying to do. We identified an important problem or opportunity. This wasn't for small little things that they were doing. This was for big projects that they were trying to get off the ground. And we asked them to give us 5 days of their time, a whole week, to focus on this one thing, this one big opportunity that really, really mattered to them. And what we did is we put into place a new structure for this week. So we replaced the way that they normally spent their days with a new structure where we just focused on one thing each day. And by adopting this new structure, we found that by the end of the week, on Friday, we could build a realistic prototype and test it with customers. We could do in 5 days what normally took teams weeks or even months of working together in the sort of default business as usual ways. So I'll walk you through the process and what happens on each day of a design sprint. Monday is all about getting the team on the same page, sort of creating shared alignment or understanding about the problem that we're working on. When teams get together and they're working on something new, one of the defaults that they often fall into is keeping everything audio only. So I'm sure you've all been there. I've certainly been there. You get a bunch of people in a room and they say, all right, let's figure it out. Let's talk about it. Let's see what to do. And every person, they come into that room with their very own sort of mental map. They have their own model inside their brain of what's right, of what's wrong, of what's a good idea, what's a bad idea. And so then they start talking and say, well, I think we should do this. Let's not do it that way. Let's do it this other way. Well, what about this way? And then you have somebody else who says, oh, I got a ton of ideas. This is going to be amazing. And so it quickly becomes very unproductive. It becomes sort of a mess. And so instead of being audio only in a design sprint, what we do is we make this work visible. So we spend the whole day Monday filling a whiteboard with all of our understanding about the project that we're working on. It can be a real whiteboard or a virtual whiteboard these days. So we write down the long-term goal. We create a map of how the customer or user is going to interact with what it is we're working on. So don't worry about the details here, but we make this big map to sort of capture our understanding. And then we write down a series of questions. We call them sprint questions. And these are the big unknowns that we have. So things we need to figure out in order to be successful with our project. But when we get this all laid out on the board, it can be very overwhelming. And in fact, a lot of teams, when they're starting out, they kind of worry about everything at once. This is sort of the default approach. They say, all right, Sebastian, you go figure out that. Emilio, you go figure out that. I'm going to take this part. Let's split up and figure it out. But we don't think that's the best way to start projects. Instead, we think it's actually better to focus on one thing at a time, to really narrow your focus to a specific target that represents the greatest risk or the greatest opportunity for the project. So what we do on Monday of a design sprint is, after making our map, and this is just a simplified version from a sprint that we ran with a company called Flatiron Health that makes software for cancer clinics. What we do is we take this map, and at the end of the day, we identify our target. So we say, okay, we understand that everything else is important, but this is the most important. And this is the part of this map that we are going to focus on for the rest of the sprint. This is the real map from that sprint, just to show you that it's only a little bit more complicated in real life than the example that we showed you in the book. All right, so we've got our understanding captured on the whiteboard. Tuesday, it's time to come up with ideas, potential solutions for how we might make this better, how we might solve the problem that we have. When a group gets together to generate solutions, what do? They often turn to brainstorming. And brainstorming is a lot of fun. It's very ubiquitous. You can get some really creative and wacky ideas. But what I found is that brainstorming is kind of a great way to get sort of low quality ideas from everyone involved. And the worst part is that it's not even truly everyone. It's only everyone who feels comfortable in a group setting. You think about a typical brainstorm where people are shouting out ideas. Some people, they're really comfortable with it. They want to give a pitch for their idea. Some people, have more ideas than other people. But some people, they don't feel comfortable participating in that way at all. And so it's not really fair, because our purple friend in the corner, they don't get an opportunity to contribute their ideas. So sometimes teams approach generating ideas a different way. We call this the lone genius. And this is where they say, okay, we're not going to do a brainstorm. Instead, you, Sebastian, you've got the skills, you've got the authority, you've got the power. We want you to go off and figure out what to do. We're going to give you time. We're going to give you everything you need. And so we're basically saying we're going to get these really, really high quality ideas, but only from a few people, only from the people who have the time, the skills, the clout, the authority, the status within that organization to express their ideas. So it might look like somebody sitting alone at a desk, generating a solution, creating a beautiful mock-up or a prototype of their idea. And when they bring that idea back into the room with all their, colleagues who were doing the brainstorm, there's really no competition. Somebody's idea that they just thought of and shouted out, it can't compete with this beautiful prototype, this beautiful mock-up that somebody made. And that's not really fair either, because each of the people here in this project, they didn't have the opportunity to contribute in the same way. So instead of these defaults, in a design sprint, we have people sketch alone, individually, but together in the same room. And we think that sketching is the best way to get high quality ideas from truly everyone who's involved in a project. And when I say sketch, I'm not talking necessarily about creating works of art. I just mean kind of any individual written work. So it might be words on a page, it might be stick figures, it might be a diagram, it might be a mock-up of a web page or a mobile app. But when we talk about sketching, we're just talking about written individual work. And we think it's really, really powerful, because it gives everybody an opportunity to think of ideas on their own, to convert those ideas into concrete solutions for fixing the problem that we're working on. And then we give everybody time to capture their solution on paper in a detailed form that they can share. So this is kind of how it looks. Each person has a chance to work. They've got materials, they've got paper, they've got everything they need, and they generate these detailed solution sketches. And because every single person in the room, every person in the sprint has the opportunity to contribute in this way, it also creates a healthy competition between ideas. It allows us to really get the best out of the team, instead of sort of just relying on the person who happens to have the loudest voice or talk the most, or the person who had the time to go and make a mock-up back at their computer. And before I move on to Wednesday, I want to tell you a quick story about how sketching can play out in real life, using an example from a sprint that we did with a company called Blue Bottle Coffee. Blue Bottle is sort of a high-end, fancy coffee company. They roast their own coffee, and then they operate a series of cafes, really nice, really high quality cafes. And they also have a website. And when we were working with them, we helped them establish their e-commerce business, so selling coffee online, so meaning that you could have their coffee being shipped to your house, so you could brew their coffee at your house. But they had this idea of transitioning from just selling one-off, just an individual bag of coffee, to creating personalized coffee subscriptions. So we did a design sprint together to try to figure this out. We gathered the team, we made the map, we wrote down the questions, and there was one question that really stood out to us, and it was, are we going to be able to figure out a customer's preferred coffee? Because if I ask you, hey, what kind of coffee do you like? There's going to be all kinds of different answers. Some people are going to say dark coffee. Some people are going to say strong coffee. Some people are going to say, oh, I like a latte, or I like my coffee with cream or black. All these different words, and they don't necessarily translate into, here's the bag of beans that we're going to send to your house that you're going to like. So we wanted to figure out ways of understanding, ways of learning what a customer's coffee preferences were. So those were the things that we sketched in our sprint. We felt that this was the key problem. This was the biggest risk. If we couldn't get this right, the rest of the project didn't matter. So some people in the sprint, they were UI designers, web designers. So they sketched UIs of what the interface would look like. We had other people in the sprint who didn't have anything to do with e-commerce. They were involved in running the cafes or providing customer support. And so their sketches involved things like shipping samples of coffee to people's houses and having a little tasting card that was printed out inside the box. And then one guy in the sprint, this was his sketch. It was literally, it's not even a sketch. It's just some words written on a piece of paper. And the idea was, what if we just texted people after we sent them a sample of coffee and we said, hey, how'd you like the coffee? So because we had all these different people, it wasn't just web designers, it wasn't just engineers, we had a range of people. Everybody brought their own perspective to how we might solve this problem. And we were able to take all those ideas and move forward in our prototype. We were able to prototype this packaging of coffee samples. During the test with customers, we actually made coffee for the customers so that they could taste it and they could give us their feedback. And this became the basis for Blue Bottle's at-home coffee subscription, which is still an important part of their business today. And I just think it's a cool example of how when everybody's involved in generating ideas through sketching, you get a much wider, much more interesting range of possible solutions. All right, so we've got all of our ideas, all of our possibilities for what we can do to achieve the goal that we've set for ourselves. And now it's time to decide which of those ideas we think are the most promising, which ideas we want to put into our prototype and test with customers. What happens when a group of people get together to try to make a decision? Well, they just talk. They talk, and they try to reach a consensus. Okay, so they try to figure out what's the decision that everybody's going to agree with, even if nobody's totally happy about it, right? So we all say, yeah, that's fine, I agree. But deep down, maybe somebody feels like, it's not great, it doesn't make a lot of sense, whatever. So that's a very powerful default that we see with a lot of teams. Sometimes teams have another default that's much worse, which is closed door decisions. Now, these decisions, they have the benefit of being very crisp, very opinionated. It's not going to be a watered down compromise of a decision. But the downside is that there's a risk that people don't understand the decision because it was just made by a single person. It was made by an executive, a manager, a boss on their own, in their office without consulting or sharing with the rest of the team. So that's not great either. And there's actually then a third sort of default mode of decision making that we sometimes see that is really scary, and that's called groupthink. And that's when everybody in the room agrees to a terrible decision. So they're talking, they're getting excited, they're getting worked up. Yeah, it's going to be great. And then they all go back to their desks and they're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. That's not going to work at all. What were we thinking? So we want to avoid each of these defaults. We want to avoid consensus, closed door decisions, and groupthink. And so instead, in a design sprint on Wednesday, we practice structured decision making. So we go through a series of decision-making exercises, starting with silent voting, and then doing a structured critique where everybody has a chance to talk about the ideas, and then relying on our decision maker. So, if we have that decision maker who would normally be making the decision behind closed door, we give them the chance to look at what the whole team thinks and then make the call at the very end. So we think it's a better way of making decisions. And because we want to avoid those endless debates, where we go round and round and round and never seem to make progress, in a design sprint, we believe it's better to decide and move on, because we know that just 2 days later, we're going to be testing with a customer. We're going to get to find out if our decision was good. We don't have to agonize over making the perfect decision because we have a way of testing our decision. There's a cool example of how the decision-making exercises on Wednesday can play out from a sprint that we did with Slack. Now, as you know, I'm assuming Slack is a tool for teams to communicate and collaborate online. And when Google Ventures invested in Slack back in 2015, I think it was, the company had been growing really, really quickly. So by that time, they had already reached 500,000 daily active users. And the question, of course, having raised this big round of funding from Google Ventures and others, was how are they going to continue to grow? And this was a big challenge because most of Slack's early customers were other technology companies. They were companies who they had maybe used chat rooms like IRC, or they had used HipChat in the past, and they understood intrinsically the value of having something like Slack for their team to keep in touch. But in order to keep growing, they were going to need to convince lots of kinds of companies, not just tech companies, to try Slack and to adopt it and with their team. So one of the things that they were going to do was they were going to spend their money from the investment on a massive advertising campaign. So they were going to have billboards, they were going to have ads in train stations and airports and the sides of buses telling people about Slack. So if you imagine the person driving this white truck says, wow, 48% less email, that sounds amazing, but what the heck is Slack? I've never heard of that thing before. So then they go back to their office, they go to their computer, they go to slack.com. And now the website has to not only explain to them what Slack is, but it has to get them to try it, because the Slack team knew that once people experience the value of Slack, then they're sold. Once they see how it could work for their team, they would get it. So the website needed to not only explain it, but get them to try it. And so our design sprint was all about how to explain it and get them to try the product. Coming into the sprint, they actually had an existing idea. So it's not always the case that you have to think of ideas in the sprint. Sometimes you can bring existing ideas in and decide whether they're the most promising, prototype them, test them, et cetera. And the existing idea that the team had was something that we called the bot team. And the idea was pretty clever, actually. It was that before joining Slack, you could join a simulation of what it was like to use Slack. And instead of your team, you'd be there with a team of bots. So little, software controlled, simulations that were basically pretending to be your coworkers, and they would give you the sense of what it's like to use Slack. And the Slack team was really excited about this. And in fact, their CEO, Stuart Butterfield, he thought that this was going to be amazing. He was really, really excited about this idea. So that was kind of our plan A coming into the sprint. But there was actually another idea that was generated on Tuesday during sketching, and we called it the guide. And it was basically turn-by-turn directions for Slack. So way less sophisticated, way less clever than the bot team. But the idea was you're new to Slack, you check it out, and it basically just kind of gives you these little guides. It says, hey, here's where you send a message, here's how you search, here's how you switch between channels. Really straightforward. And enough people in the room during the sprint thought that this could work, so they actually decided to move forward with both of these ideas. And that's the thing that I haven't told you yet about a design sprint, is you don't have to choose one idea. You can actually choose multiple ideas and move them forward into prototyping and testing. So we took both of these ideas forward. We gave them each their own brand names, so the customers thought that they were actually testing two competing products, and we pitted them head to head in the customer test on Friday. And what we found was that the bot team actually didn't work all that well. It was confusing. It didn't do a really great job of explaining what Slack was or what it would be like to use it. And the team that we were working with, the team from Slack, the designers and engineers and everybody, they felt like they dodged a bullet. They felt very relieved because they hadn't gone and spent months of time building this complicated, clever, sophisticated solution that wasn't likely to work anyway. And then there was a silver lining, which was that this new idea, the guide, actually tested really, really well with customers. It worked far better than anybody imagined that it would. And it became the basis for Slack's onboarding experience. So it has since changed a little bit, but for many years when you would sign into Slack, you would see these little turn-by-turn directions that would show you what Slack was and how to use it. And well, it worked. Slack continued to grow very, very quickly. They recently announced that they passed 12 million, more than 12 million daily active users. Slack went public last year, and they're now I don't even know, $40 billion company or something like that. And of course, it's not all because of the design sprint, but we do think it's a cool example of how a team can use a design sprint and can use the decision-making techniques on Wednesday to make sure that they're heading in the right direction when it comes to something that is as important, as mission critical to them as helping new customers get started with the product. So once the decision is made, we're ready to build our prototype. Now, the most powerful default of all the days I've talked about is the default of building it. And it makes a ton of sense. This is what everybody wants to do. They say, all right, we've got our idea, let's go, let's make it happen. And so everybody gets together, they get their tools, and they get started building. And at first, it's very straightforward, it's very fun, things are going well, but quickly you encounter twists and turns. The process of building is never as straightforward as you think it's going to be. Things don't go the way that you assumed they would. You've got problems, you've got issues, you've got setbacks. And meanwhile, while this process of building is taking longer than you ever imagined it could, it gives an opportunity for all the other people who weren't involved in the sprint or in the project to jump in with their questions, with their ideas. You might even have people questioning the whole project. Why are we even doing this? Why did we think this was a good idea? We should have done something else. And so instead of these problems that come from this default of building our ideas, in a design sprint, what we do is we fake it. We create a fake version, a simulation of our idea that we can put in front of a customer, and they're going to think it's real. It's going to look real, but it's not. We didn't write any code. We can't launch it. We can't release it. We can't announce it. It's a fake version. So many times it's a fake website. It can be a fake app. And the tools for making fake apps these days are absolutely amazing. With really not a lot of work, you can create apps that are super realistic looking, that allow you to scroll, and they have animations and transitions. Sometimes it's fake packaging, like this example from Blue Bottle that I shared. Sometimes we'll create a fake version of a sales deck. So sort of the marketing or sales materials for a product that doesn't exist yet, that the team is just thinking of doing. It's possible to fake services, in-person services, and changing the physical environment is important, of course, but really the key to faking services is to rewrite the script. So actually changing how the team interacts with customers in the process of delivering that service, and that can really change the whole nature of the service itself. We did one sprint where we actually created a fake robot personality. So this is a robot called the Relay that makes deliveries in hotels. And we actually removed the touchscreen interface that was on it, and we put into its place an iPad mini that was running a keynote presentation that had a face, and it said little messages, and it made some sounds. But if you're not sure what to prototype, if you're working on something and you're like, how are we going to prototype this? My suggestion is to prototype the marketing. Because if you can create a fake website, a fake ad, a fake landing page for something that you're thinking of doing that doesn't exist yet, it's super easy to do, and you can learn a lot because you can see how customers react to the value proposition, how they react to the concept of what you're doing long before you've ever actually made the thing that you're thinking of doing. So that's prototyping. Once the prototype is done, we're ready for Friday's test. And the final default that I want to share with you is this default of wanting to wait for perfect data. And we see this everywhere because when people, they want to do a test, run an experiment, especially when there's engineers involved, when it's a tech company, they want it to be perfect. They want to do an A/B test. It's going to be statistically significant. They're going to get enough traffic and enough data, and they send it off to the data science team who can write a report and generate a dashboard. And all that stuff is really good and really worthwhile. But when you're just starting a new project, we think it's far too slow. So instead, what we want to do is we want to get customer reactions right now. We don't want to wait. So We do simple customer interviews on Friday of a design sprint. We bring in customers who fit a target profile. We put the prototype in front of her or him. We walk through the prototype. We sort of ask questions. We watch, we listen, we learn. We do that 5 times over the course of the day on Friday. While the interviews are going on in one room, the team is watching in a different room and they're taking notes. And they're not just sort of writing down high-level observations, but they're actually keeping score. So they're kind of filling out this spreadsheet with red or green, which is basically answers to those big questions. So if you think back to Monday, we wrote down those questions, the sprint questions, can we figure out a customer's preferred coffee? Will they trust us? Will they be willing to pay? Whatever those questions are. On Friday, we mark down what we think our answers to those questions are based on what we heard from those customers. Friday's test is sort of like an opportunity to travel to the future. It's like you get to jump in your DeLorean time machine. That's a Back to the Future reference for those of you who aren't familiar. And you get to zoom ahead to the day that your product is finally live, it's finally done, or the day when your marketing campaign launches, or even just the moment when customers first realize that you exist as a company, or your users first encounter what you've done. And you get to be there with them in that moment, and you get to take what you've learned, bring it back to the present day so that you can make better decisions about how you're spending your time and your energy and your resources as a team. So that's the design sprint. That's what happens on each of the 5 days. In 2016, we published our book, Sprint. And since then, we have seen this process spread to thousands of teams around the world, not just startups, but big tech companies and agencies and consultancies and large corporations and universities and governments and nonprofits. And my hope is that we will be able to add your dot to this map, that whatever you go on to create, wherever you go on to work, whatever kind of projects that you start, we hope that that you'll consider using a design sprint, and we'll put your dot on this map. And I think you'll find that when you run design sprints, you waste less time because you work more efficiently, but you're also able to take bigger risks. You're able to try things that seem a little bit crazy because you know that if you fail, you're only going to fail in front of 5 customers. It's not going to be a big disaster. And this process brings you closer to customers. It allows you to get in a habit of really listening and watching and talking to your customers, but it also brings you closer to your team. You get to see skills and perspectives and backgrounds that you didn't know your team had when you're working together in this way. But I think for me, the thing that really keeps me excited about design sprints after all these years and all these sprints is that I really think it's a recipe for spending time on the work that truly matters. So not trying to answer your email as quickly as possible or spend all day sitting in meetings, but really getting to the core of why you do what you do, the things that you care about. And to me, that's really what the design sprint is all about. So I encourage you to check out our book. In addition to a lot of the stories that I've shared and a bunch more, it also has this really, really detailed step-by-step sprint checklist. So it's literally hour by hour. Here's exactly how to run a design sprint. You can also go to our website, thesprintbook.com, which has a bunch of resources, including these checklists. It has a guide to running a remote design sprint. So that's something that we created at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to help people who were running sprints remotely. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, or should I say muchas gracias. And I would be happy to answer some questions. If you want to email me, if you want to connect on LinkedIn, if you want to send me a tweet, whatever, I welcome that. And I can hang out for another 10, 15, 20 minutes and answer any questions that you have.